From the campus of the University of Kentucky, this is Behind the Blue. I'm Kody Kiser with UK Strategic Communications.
I think the same way that our personal mental health benefits from considering our childhood, the good and the bad, I think our country, the mental health of our country, and the tenor of our communal engagement is deeply affected by reckoning. History is full, and there are a lot of good things in history, but there are some negatives that we need to acknowledge. But much like dealing with childhood trauma for ourselves, it makes us stronger. It doesn't weaken us. And, Toni Morrison said about writing Beloved, if they could live it, I could write it. And I tell my students, if they could live it and she could write it, we could read it. And I say that directly about people who want to ban Beloved. But I think that's relevant for Frank, what Frank is doing with historical literature as well and writing his historical poetry. We are paying homage to the ancestors for the suffering they went through by taking it seriously. If they could live it and he could write it, we can read it, and we'll be better off for doing that.
That's Kristine Yohe, a professor of English at Northern Kentucky University. Yohe has just published a new book titled Reckoning with the Past, The Historical Poetry of Frank X. Walker, a thoughtful, book-length study of Walker's historical persona poetry. In his work, Walker gives voice to pivotal figures like York, Isaac Murphy, and Medgar Evers, inviting readers to engage history with honesty, empathy, and deeper context, and to think about the past not as a distant record, but as something that still shapes our lives today. Walker, a UK English professor, poet, and the first African-American writer to be named Kentucky Poet Laureate, says this kind of poetry can put readers on the inside of the story, bringing an emotional truth that traditional accounts often can't capture. And while most people won't sit down with the 300-page version of history, he believes poetry can invite them in because the truth is the grand sum of all those points of view where everybody gets heard. On this episode of Behind the Blue, Yohe and Walker join me to talk about the book, what it means to reckon with the past, and why literature can help us confront both the good and the painful realities that shape the American story. We also explore how they bring this work into the classroom, what surprises students most when they encounter these histories for the first time, and how research, imagination, and craft can help students build empathy and better understand the relationship between past and present. Kristine Yohe and Frank X. Walker, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with us on Behind the Blue.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Always great to be here.
Kristine, I want to talk a little bit about your background. You are a professor of English at Northern Kentucky University. Tell me a little bit about that position and your work, and maybe start off a little bit about kind of your background, where you're from originally.
Okay, great. I was born and raised in Durham, North Carolina. Went to did my undergraduate studies at Emory University in Atlanta, and got my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. And I have been at NKU 28 and a half years. It was my first job right out of grad school. And my specialty is African-American literature. And the position I was hired in is African-American literature. I am white, but this is something I've long specialized in. I did my early research and scholarship all focused on Nella Larson and Toni Morrison, Black women writers, and have done a lot of teaching and some publishing on Morrison. But when I first learned about Frank X. Walker and the Appalachian poets in 2001, I started teaching their works and his works. In 2013, I started teaching full book-length works by Frank. Got to know him when he was at NKU 2009 to 2008 to 2010. He was our writer in residence there, which was a great opportunity for myself and my students, our students. And so then I decided to do this book. And so that's taken me about the last 7 years, but it's been a delight to focus on.
And Frank, you are a professor of English here in the University of Kentucky Department of English, and also of African American and Africana Studies here at UK, native of Kentucky from Danville.
Yes, still.
Still. So we want to talk about this book and the connection here, which I feel is kind of unique. And so the book is called Reckoning with the Past, The Historical Poetry of Frank X. Walker. And it's kind of a study of your historical persona poetry and kind of a look at why that matters now. So the first question I want to kind of pitch out to both of you, when people hear reckoning with the past, or when you hear reckoning with the past, what does that mean to you?
Well, for me, I think it invites people into a conversation about history, and not just a conversation, but kind of an interrogation of history, because a lot of things that people accept as historically accurate is sometimes shared in a limited way or one-sided, and people don't get the full story quite often. And I've always been attracted to those stories that have historical relevance that have been told in an incomplete way or have left important parts of the story out. So, I'm not interested in every part of history. I couldn't sit down with just any history book, but there are things that deal with Kentucky, that deal with the South, that deal with Appalachia, African American literary people that are just my cup of tea that I could read all day long. So I tend to mine material that comes out of that kind of very deep but kind of similar space. All my books are connected, I would say, by either history, social justice, identity, place, or family. And you could take those main ingredients. And as far as my work that I'm writing about, no matter what the book is and the subject, that I tend to draw on the same source material that comes out of research, obviously, memory and imagination, but the things that hold that together are really social justice, history, identity, place, and family. And that subject material is not something I own, and it allows me to look into other lives in the same way. If I can answer how any particular historical character or person responds in those same areas, I feel like I know them. And when I'm researching, I'm trying to find material that allows me to get that close to them. And I think that gives me an advantage when it comes to writing and then reading material that people respond to, who believe it sounds very authentic, or very, that they may say things like, wow, that's how I imagine that person sounded, or I imagine that's exactly what he or she said, or sometimes, how did you get that close to that story or that person? And the research is driven by it, and there's imagination, obviously, and empathy. But if you take out the research and the archival material that's available that most poets don't use, you're at a disadvantage. You it's like trying to hunt with only one weapon or one bullet, when you can go fully armed with all this research material and pretty much write anything, I think.
Kristine, what do you take from that?
Well, it's an interesting phrase to me because I think in many ways, Frank has always been reckoning with the past in his poetry. I think even the family poetry, a lot of it, you're reckoning with the past, including like with your father and some, issues of history in your more recent book of your ancestors. And so I think Frank's always reckoned with the past in some ways, but he has these 6 books now that are really focused on historical poetry. And so, his first one, Buffalo Dance, came out in 2004. So that was, a long time ago for Reckoning with the Past. My title of the book I had 7-8 years ago. And quite frankly, after the summer of 2020 and the national reckoning that many of us thought was really going to happen, I was optimistic after the tragic murder of George Floyd. The word reckoning quickly became a cliche. And I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't call my book this because it's too common. But the thing is, it's actually quite accurate of what Frank has been doing. And I think the backlash that's happened since 2020, of course, backlash since 1619, the first enslaved Africans brought to the continent. But I think the backlash has made the term even more important, and the possible little bit cliche of the term I'm okay with, because I think what we do, reconciling, it's what you do with a bank statement, or what you do with anything else. But I also grew up in North Carolina where we'd say, I reckon, just to mean I think. And so reckoning with the past is to take it seriously and to engage with it fully. And I think what Frank does in his poetry, and I know this with my students, and I've heard him use the word authenticity many times in person and in interviews I've read of what he's striving for. That's what he achieves, because the readers get an understanding that they're like, oh my goodness, why didn't I know this before? Or oh, why is this history hidden? And I think I love history just in history books, but history via art, which is what he does with his poetry. It's also what he does with his paintings, bringing history to art. It makes us understand it in a way that's not just intellectual, but it's emotional, it's visceral, it's physical. And I see that with my students, but I also experience it. And so I think that reckoning with history is telling the truth about history. And anybody who's trying to silence that is, in my opinion, misguided.
I think it's an interesting context that you're working in, especially in this reckoning sense, because as Frank was talking about this, and there were some things that you were saying that just kind of continued to call back and make me think about this idea of, we have this, I think, this generalized concept of what history is, and that's kind of the accepted thing, and that's what people have learned in school. And there's only so much time that you have, K through 12, to learn kind of the basics of history or your history. But it really is kind of, things like this really pull back the curtain on the idea that there are so many stories that have only been told from a particular perspective, have only been written about in the educational literature. Those other stories exist, but due to whatever the constraint is, whether it's time or agenda or whatever, those particulars, and good and bad. There are tons of great stories from history of people who have done great things that don't even get mentioned, that you just never hear about, along with stories of perseverance, stories of persecution, stories of struggle that just never get mentioned in the context. And so when I look at this, you describe this as a literary excavation, and this pulling of stories and voices and craft and cultural memory. Is that accurate? Or is that like part of this process of what you're doing, is trying to pull some of these things forward in a sense?
Well, yes, because I think that's what Frank is doing. Frank and the other Appalachian poets take as a mission statement, to give voice to the voiceless and uncover hidden history. And so because he does that so effectively in the other poets as well, to some extent, not all of them focused to the same degree, but because he does that so effectively in his writing, what I try to do in my book is to help readers of Walker's work understand it better and have some of the background material. I did a lot of comparable, not the same volume, I'm sure, research of what Frank did in terms of reading what the Lewis and Clark journals say, reading what scholars of Lewis and Clark say, reading what scholars who now recognize that York, the enslaved Black man who was technically owned by William Clark, recognizing his role. And so doing that research of the archival materials to reinforce the interpretation that Frank does in his art, I think helps readers I think it deepens their experience. I think it illuminates something that his art definitely illuminates. But if they know a little more about it, that's what I'm trying to do, is give them material, the background material, some of the same things he used, some things I don't know what he met with an Nez Perce nation out in Oregon, Idaho. And, I didn't do that, but I've done what I can do on online and in books. And also we've had a couple of conversations that I was able to draw upon and ask occasional questions. I've tried to make them occasional. I've tried not to make them constant. And so that, I hope, does, excavate those people even more. And to understand, someone who recently learned about York told me that he'd read a lot about Lewis and Clark, but he didn't know about York. And I think, Frank, you said you had a similar experience of learning about York. And so I think that history has been hidden for a lot of people, and getting to it through art and, literary analysis, I think can deepen that understanding.
For someone who's new to persona poetry, with either of you, what makes this form uniquely suited for truth-telling?
Well, I think for me, when I think about persona poems and historical poetry, is that if the goal is to get as close to the truth as possible, the advantage of putting it in the voice of the participant gives you a unique perspective that puts you automatically on the inside of the story. And if you also have the added advantage of adding a layer to that teller that reflects that person's emotional energy or mental state or disposition, if they're angry or if they're missing their partner or loved one, those things will come to bear in the telling. I think that journalists and biographers can't do that. I mean, they legally have to be so objective that a lot of people describe that kind of work as dry, as unemotional. But poets have the advantage of adding emotion. And once you add that emotion and you lean into the use of sensory images, it raises that telling to cinema. So that when people experience the scene, it's almost as if they were in a small movie or a short scene on a stage with Shakespearean actors of the best quality. And I think that that's one of the advantages we have that leaves people at the end of a reading, emotionally changed because they were moved, and they were moved because they felt something that either made them angry, made them sad, made them understand that nostalgic moment, but they didn't expect to be. But so when they were unexpectedly moved more than once over the course of a longer telling, it's like a roller coaster ride. And sometimes people are exhausted. I know I am as a reader, but when the audience is exhausted and worn out, it's like they've been on that ride with you, and they were with you on the highs and the lows. It's not unusual for people to cry if the story is too sad, and if it triggers something in them and their personal lives that connects to something that makes them sad. Then it becomes very universal in that sense. But my preference when I'm writing poetry is to use persona poems that invite people into the story. I think that most people are not going to sit down and read the 300-page version of that event, but they may sit through an 80-page poetry collection about that event, or they may sit through a 45-minute reading where a poet is reading about that event and that person, and they feel like they got the whole story anyway. And that's the goal, especially if you're trying to build a collection of work and not just a single poem. And I think that I'm still trying to get it right. I mean, the first time I did it, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just trying to tell this story in a unique way from a point of view that nobody ever heard before, that made sense to me. That was something I wanted to hear, and that was York. If York, I'd ask myself, if York told this story, how different would it be from Lewis and Clark's? And then that became Buffalo Dance. And then, that was finished, and somebody asked me about, well, what about York's wife? What did the women have to say? Why did you leave them out? What about Native Americans? Why did you leave them out? And I'm thinking, I thought I had done a good thing, but I realized immediately that there were other points of view that were worth hearing, that belonged in that telling. So the second book, When Winter Come, tries to fold in those missing voices. And even then I thought I was done, that's it, the story's done. But then as we move through time, there's a whole part of York's life that was in debate about how his life ended, that people, debate about what really happened to him versus the historical definition that says, he died in the mountains of Tennessee from the cholera on his way back to William Clark to be a slave again. He wanted to be enslaved again, which is incredulous to me. I just refuse to believe that, knowing what he experienced and doing all the research and understanding, even being in the space he had visited, that there's no way you can become that free, experience those things, and then pretend like they never happened and decide that, you know what, in spite of this perfect situation, I think I'd rather go and be an enslaved man again. That is crazy to me. But the historical accounts are considered valid because they were written down. One man said it to another man, but it leaves out a whole other set of criteria that validates what's true and what's not, and what can be challenged and what can't. And I have a lot of respect for oral tradition. I have a lot of respect for storytelling. I have a lot of respect for history. So somewhere in there is, my mother would say there are two sides to every story, and then there's the truth. And the truth is, the grand sum of all those points of view, where everybody gets heard. And then once you hear everybody's opinion, then you've heard the truth, and then you get to tell your version of it based on all this research material that you got to hear personally, instead of hearing one person's side of the story and then find out later that, well, that person got it wrong. They left out this whole other side of the story. And that's, to me, that's compelling. That makes me eager to do the research, to take that long trip, to read another book, to listen or watch a video, again, so I can be as authentic as possible. So people, I think the best compliment I've ever gotten is when a gentleman asked me, where did I find all these things that York had written down? Like, how is that possible? That he couldn't even write. So how did you find things he had written down? And I'm trying to convince him that, well, he didn't write them. I wrote them, imagining what his voice would sound like. And he was so confused. He was like, well, but it's York. I mean, I read them. I mean, they sound like York, not you. And I'm like, well, that's the idea. I'm trying to get out of the way as an author and a poet, but it needs to feel and sound, but mostly to be received as something that's real, that respects history, and I think that's the challenge.
When you take on a voice like that, what comes first? Is it the question about it, or a feeling you get about, discovering this, or is it the research? What's kind of first in the process to taking on that voice?
I think that there's a desire that comes first, and the desire to fill an empty space. When I first sat down to write a poem about York, it was driven by all this new information I had learned, and I tried to imagine. I remember sitting down thinking, I wonder what it was like for York to arrive at the ocean for the first time. He's never seen the ocean before. He's been away from his family for a year and a half. He's been through all these arduous, events and challenges, weather and Native Americans and the mountains. And now he's got this beautiful moment. What's he feeling and thinking? I had to feel that, answer my own question by trying to imagine what he was feeling and thinking. And it made it easier to travel to the Pacific Ocean, stand in almost the same spot, and then look out at the ocean and say, this is what he saw. I mean, much hasn't changed. It's still the Pacific Ocean. It's still cold. The breeze, it's still sand here and rocks, and there are birds. And then to think, what if he saw a whale for the first time? And he had to tell somebody, well, how big was that whale? Well, it was big as a cabin. Right, that's what he has that's available to him. He can't say an SUV, that just wouldn't fit. But he knows what a small slave cabin would look like. But so it just, and sometimes it's also fun to be in that space, to kind of leave this world, and the research kind of allows you to create another universe that already existed. But the more research you do, the more details you can add to that universe, and then. When you're looking for those poems, you just go back in that universe. The same way fiction writers work, I'm sure. But for me, I really enjoy this work, this kind of work. And it's important to me to try to get as close to that character as possible, and to hear that voice, and to believe, I need to believe it's real too. And then get out of the way. and let him or her tell her story. Or sometimes it's a thing speaking. In the Medgar Evers book, there's the bullet has something to say. In the York books, his hunting shirt, his hatchet, his knife, the river, all have something to say to advance the narrative. And I think those voices are equally important. And I'm trying to make people believe if the river could talk, this is what the river would say.
Kristine, in your book, you're looking at the three people that Frank's work has focused on, which is York and Isaac Murphy and Medgar Evers. And you argue that these lives kind of bridge this disconnect between past and present. And we've kind of been talking about this in the sense of like history lost, stories untold, things like that. Where do you see that disconnect most clearly?
The disconnect between past and present?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's not just the current environment where some people are openly suppressing history. I think it's just so much history has been written all along by the victors. I mean, that happens all over the world, that the people who win a war are the ones who get to tell the story. I was reading something this morning about Indigenous history in North Carolina that I'd never read before, because what I've read is by the white settlers. And that's just, it has to do with power. And it's sometimes who wins a conflict, but also just who has the power, who has literacy, who has access to printing, who has access to all of that. And so in terms of bridging it to the present, to me, I feel like my job is to help illuminate what Frank is doing with the greater goal of fighting against racism and fighting against oppression and supporting the truth, quite literally, to uncover what's been hidden. And I think it empowers us today to understand where we've been in the past. I think I find my students hungry to know more and sometimes really irritated at what has been hidden from them. And so as an educator, I feel like my role is to help them have access to knowledge and help them decide for themselves what they want to do with that knowledge. I mean, you can't indoctrinate someone on how to use a comma, much less what to think about anything political or historical. And it's not my goal. My goal is to help them think for themselves. And I think we more fully are able to think for ourselves if we are not denied the truth. And so I think by learning more accurately what happened in the past, it helps us to reflect where we are. And this is, the 250th anniversary of our country. And I think looking to the back, to the past, sure, we can be proud of many things in our history. I mean, I love my country. We fly the flag. But history is not only about feel-good things. And if history only makes you feel good, you probably are missing a lot. And think about your own life. If you only told someone all the good things you've done, would that be the whole story? No. All of us are a mixed bag, and history of our country is a mixed bag. And so you can love your country and tell the truth about its past. That's not disrespecting it. Quite frankly, it's the opposite, because by more fully embodying and connecting with what really happened, which we understand when we read about York, when we read about Medgar Evers, when we read about Isaac Murphy. I mean, I have students who, when they read the Isaac Murphy book, did not know there ever were black jockeys, did not know Isaac Murphy won the Kentucky Derby multiple times in the 1890s before black jockeys were forced out. Toni Morrison, the author I did a lot of research on over the years, she has written historical fiction. What she's done with Margaret Garner to inspire her to write her Pulitzer Prize winning, and many people consider her best work, Beloved. What she has done to go to the interior lives to imagine how enslaved people would have felt, I think is quite comparable to what Frank does, where she goes to try to access a kind of truth, what she calls it, which isn't like what really happened, but it's what could have happened and what did happen in the big picture. She's able to do that so effectively, and I think it helps her readers. I think what Frank does with his historical poetry is quite comparable, and I think all of us benefit from that fuller truth.
Looking at Isaac Murphy, coming home to a Kentucky memory, Frank, why was that story calling to you in particular, and why did you feel it was important that Kentucky and beyond hear that story through poetry?
I think Isaac Murphy is just part of the broader story of Kentucky history that had always been undertold, in my opinion. That book wasn't the first time I'd mentioned, Isaac Murphy in my poetry. He'd kind of been in the horizon, but always just kind of way back there for me. But I was excited to do the research to find out as much that was available, mostly in people's files. I mean, when I wrote my collection about Isaac Murphy and his story, there wasn't a major biography about him out. I'd like to think that my book stimulated a lot more interest in Isaac, and there were a lot of people who came on the heels of that and wrote children's books and huge award-winning bios. There were movies, specials on TV, programming at Churchill Downs and Keeneland. None of that was happening before, I Dedicate This Ride and the play and the piece that KET did called Kentucky Muse, I Dedicate This Ride, that really focused on what we were doing with Isaac Murphy. And so when that happened, it felt good to not just tell his story, but to add to his story the fact that, he was married to Lucy and that their relationship was not just important, but, whenever they mentioned him, they should mention Lucy. And it also allowed people to understand why I thought it was kind of criminal to dig his body up from where he lay in the cemetery next to his wife and replant him somewhere else next to a horse. To separate them in death, was just always a tragedy to me. And that was news to most people. But I think there's a thing happening this weekend on Valentine's Day here in Lexington that will be a celebration of Lucy and Isaac Murphy, that this group of horse people called the Phoenix Rising Society are sponsoring. And we just found out about it last night, and my wife said, "Why did they invite you to come and read those poems?" I'm thinking they must not have read the book, because the book includes what I think are some love stories, some love poems between Isaac and Lucy that just really tries to illuminate the quality of that and the depth of that relationship and the fact that it was important. And I think for me, I could not tell Isaac Murphy's story and not include his mother's voice, his wife's voice, his teacher's voice. All those people around him really shaped who he was. The man that we only knew about in kind of a one-dimensional way because of newspaper accounts or because of his athletic accomplishments. That's just part of him. But when you fold in his loved ones and his relatives, then you get to see the whole man. And that's what I was trying to create. Not a cartoon character or a flat, two-dimensional thing on paper, but something that was whole and real and that felt genuine and authentic. Always about the authentic.
And again, reveals something about what Kentucky remembers and forgets.
Absolutely, because one thing that Toni Morrison has said, rather controversially, is she has talked about those often reviled and considered quite racist statues of the young black jockey, which I grew up in North Carolina seeing, but also seeing them as shameful. She says, well, they didn't start out shamefully because they were reflecting the reality of black jockeys who were quite accomplished. And Toni Morrison co-edited she was the textbook editor for a book in 1971 or 72 called The Black Book, in which she includes something about the black jockeys who won the Kentucky Derby. So she was aware of Isaac Murphy. There's a display about Isaac Murphy in the Black Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So he's getting more attention, and I think Frank's book has made a big difference there. But Toni Morrison and some others have always known about him, but it got buried because of the same reason that black jockeys got pushed out of the sport. Black jockeys got pushed out of the sport quite simply by white supremacy, and that same philosophy has not seen that history as worthy of praising. And fortunately, Frank's work and some other attention has made a big difference in telling that truth about history. And that gives pride, certainly to young Black people, but it's also pride to white people to know the fuller story and just to know the greatness of an amazing jockey who didn't use a whip, but was able to accomplish great things. And what I think when Frank was talking about the love story between Frank and Lucy, I was able to find a photo of Lucy that I've included in my book, and some photos of Isaac Murphy, the Keeneland and the Kentucky Historical Society, very great resources for that. But those poems in the book give us a sense of Isaac the man that we don't only get from the athletic accomplishments, the tenderness with which you write about how Lucy sees Isaac's sense of touch, which is relevant to how he rides a horse and how he handles a horse. But it's also just relevant to his relationship to his mother and to his wife, his just kindness and his gentleness and his sensitivity. And I think back to the earlier issue of the persona poem, certainly a poem that was told in the third person, like he, she, rather than I, me. A poem in the third person could tell us about that, could talk about that relationship. But the first person, if we instead of hearing about Lucy, we hear from Lucy, I think that's extraordinarily more powerful, and it's more intimate, and it's more authentic. And I tell my students when we talk about persona poetry, because some of my students are creative writers, and they tell them they should find something in history they want to write about and, give that voice to the voiceless. But persona poems are analogous in a way to a play in what the lines would be for the actors. And certainly the Isaac Murphy has been made into a play. When Winter Come, the second York book, was made into a play at my university, Northern Kentucky University, and including one of my former students, Unina Barber Payne, who's now an accomplished scholar and PhD in her own right. But, that there have been dramatic interpretations. There's UK Dance did Afralacha, the poem, and performed it. And that's in the Coal Black Voices documentary that Media Working Group produced in 2001 or 2002. And Frank was an executive producer in that as well. And so I think that seeing the persona works performed is very powerful, but it's because of the way they're written. It's because they're written with that sense of memory, research, imagination, and empathy that he so articulately tells us about, so eloquently tells us about, so that we understand what we're looking for and what he's doing. But I think it's telling the truth about history, but from the point of view of those people. That's what's especially powerful. Like the man who thought, well, how did you get what York really said? And that means you knocked it out of the park because he believed it and it felt authentic. And I see that all the time with my students. I feel it myself.
Well, and in moving to this third area, this third person, Medgar Evers, and the stakes being really nationally relevant, again, speaking in this truth-telling way, you're framing this as truth-telling with an eye towards reconciliation. Kind of what does that look like on the page to you as you're kind of moving into that?
Well, I think it's really powerful because, of course, Medgar Evers was assassinated by a Ku Klux Klansman. But back to that first-person persona, in Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, which is the most award-winning of the books of persona poetry until his Loaded 9 Times, the more recent book that got the Penn Volcker Award, which is a big national award. But that book is different. It's not focused only on one person. It is some persona poems, but some of them are not. And so it's a little bit of a different approach, but it's still very powerful historical poetry. But the Medgar Evers book, I think, really helps us understand in a way that we never could. He has poems from not only the point of view of Myrlie, Medgar Evers' widow, that are so delicate. We get Myrlie's sense of forgiveness of the killer. It's mind-blowing. But when I read her autobiography, she talks about that. And so it's, he had very good research foundation on which to then, instill his imagination. But we get poems from the point of view of the killer, Byron de la Beckwith. And my students are shocked at that, because it's easy to dismiss the killer as an evil racist monster, which I think he was, but it's also the truth that he was a human being who at some point was radicalized. And what led to that. And we sort of see it that part of that from Byron's point of view in how he treats his wives. He had two different wives, not at the same time, but we see those relationships in that Frank writes in the poems, and we see his coarseness, and we see his disrespect. But I think we get it most powerfully through Merle, the widow, when she imagines before Byron lost his parents, when he was a good little boy, could things have been different? And I think what Frank does a lot in his work is says, what if? What if this had been different? And speculates on the past in a way that I think is very powerful and very effective.
You've described poetry as a place where sensitive topics can be approached in a human way. Is there something, I don't know, is there something just uniquely powerful about that, about using poetry for that? Is that other things just can't really fit in that keyhole in the same way?
I don't think it's unique to poetry, but I think it's unique to the arts. I think there's something about the arts that bring people together, that can allow people who speak different languages, who come from a different experience, to love the same thing, but for such similar reasons that they recognize that they have more in common than not. That I've been at concerts and moved to tears, or in a movie and really, really moved, and in the middle of a standing ovation, and looked around at somebody else who also appreciated it in the same way. And there's a connection in that moment. And I know nothing about the other person, but knowing that they love and appreciate the same thing that I do, that same level, says something about that person to me that kind of shrinks the space between us. So it's going to be easier to trust that person, because if they were able to do that and I just did that, then we're doing something alike. So I think there's something powerful about the arts that allows people to get closer together than they might have ordinarily been, to develop trust between each other faster than, say, at a football game where you have to hate the other team, where there's room in an art exhibit to all be on the same team. We all like this thing. That's why we're here. That shared humanity that comes to the surface creates a space for us to be more human, to experience each other in a way that is bigger than stereotypes, that's bigger than anything I ever heard about you, to see you in this most human way. I really loved a recent story I read about Otega Oweh, who went over to the bench after the defeat of Tennessee and found their superstar on the bench with his head down and a towel over his head and in tears. And he knelt down on one knee and said something to him that made him stand up and share an embrace. And we'll never know what they said to each other, but the power of that in the heat of this, really dramatic competition speaks to their shared humanity. And then Ament talked about how much respect he had for Oweh because of that moment, that he could have been there gloating and bragging, but he didn't see a defeated, adversary. He saw another human being who was hurting, and he stepped into that space to lift him up. And I think that those are things that don't make the headlines, but I think those are the things that, as a poet, I'm always looking for that kind of space and that kind of interaction and communication. I think that's where we live. That's where art can be harvested from. And if you can recreate that or that narrative or that story in a painting, in a carving, in a poem, in a play, in a piece of music, if you can recreate that, you make something magic for people. And that's, I think writing and poetry, it is art. I am trying to create art. I am trying to create something to share with other people. It's not just for me. And the fact that, it has powerful effects on other people, I think educators recognize. I think Chris was the first educator to recognize the potential of this work as a collective, to start teaching whole books of it in the classroom. And when I started visiting those classes and seeing how the students were responding, it was beyond heartwarming. It was beyond, gratifying for my ego. I was a little surprised at first. I didn't know to what degree other people, especially young people, mostly white students, were getting from this information in the text. And it wasn't just the information by itself, it's the way it was being taught. So I'm fortunate enough to have, I think, great material in the hands of an even better teacher. And I think those two things combined created this amazing book. And I hope that when people come to the book for the first time, that they get the power of having been in her classroom, and through that get the interest in wanting to be in those books that I wrote. I think that it'll work backwards, in the way that you could pay something forward. I think this whole thing is working backwards. And eventually, I hope that they will read her book and say, I got to buy everything Frank Walker ever wrote. But, there may be enough. There may be enough quotes in your book to make them feel like, that was enough. I get it. So we'll see. It remains to be seen. I don't think we can measure it, so one can hope.
Well, I see my book as a companion to your books. And I wasn't allowed to give too many long quotes because of permissions and all of that technicality, all those logistics. And so I absolutely see my book as something to read when you have Frank's books right there. And you can get them from the library, but I hope you'll buy them. And, that's what I want to promote. Is I want to promote his work and promote the other Appalachian poets and promote Black literature and promote the truth. And so that's my goal when I use any platform I may have to do that. And that's the motivation to write the book.
To something you mentioned earlier, and we don't have to spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but we were kind of talking about, those stories that were kind of lost or buried and now being uncovered, and something kind of touched on this idea of people feeling kind of uncomfortable wrestling with some of these things. And I was just struck with this idea of, I find it interesting to some degree because there was something you said that made me think about this. So much of our American persona these days is this idea of, I came through something, like telling you were talking about people tell the good parts of a story, but so often our kind of identity is wrapped up in this country of talking about the bad parts. I had this bad thing happen to me, but I came through it and I'm stronger for that. Like, that's such a narrative kind of
overcoming.
Yeah. Like this overcoming thing. It's such a purely kind of American spirit kind of thing personified. Like we kind of wear that in a general sense. And I find it interesting that is such a powerful thing. But yet, like you said, we often just want to talk about the good parts. History's written by the winners. We want to talk about, as opposed to talking about it wasn't all good to get to where we are. It wasn't all bad. It wasn't all good. It's still not all good. It's not all bad. But we kind of want to shoebox some of that stuff up and tuck it away. And it really makes me think about just this general conversation we've had just this week about the Super Bowl halftime.
Yes.
And the subtext and the underlying messaging that comes through the visualization of what you're seeing there through that. And I've seen tons of videos of people explaining these things to me. And I've watched it just like, well, I never knew that. I never even thought about that. Wow. That's all of these things were so like, not in a way of it's just there for you to take and digest and process. I didn't feel assaulted by any of this. It was just one of these things that's like, this is this story that's kind of the subtext of this whole thing. Do with it what you will, I guess, but it's timely, your work is timely in light of things happening like that, for example, or even last year's Super Bowl with Kendrick Lamar's halftime show, which was full of subtext and a lot of messaging there as well.
Well, I think what you're describing is what happens with art. We can appreciate a painting on a wall just based on looking at it. But if we're like listening to the narrative or going with a guide, we're like, oh, I didn't understand that as well. And the Bad Bunny performance in the Super Bowl, I loved the energy, the music, the dancing. I caught some of the cultural references, but since then, I've read so much about it and I appreciate it more. And that's what I hope my book can do for his art. Some people can appreciate his poetry, and people come with various amounts of knowledge to that appreciation. But when we have someone else explain it to us, it helps us appreciate it more, and it enriches it. That can happen in a classroom, and I hope it does happen in my classrooms. I'm sure it happens in Frank's classrooms. But a book about something, about art, can also give us that illumination, can give us that richness. And I've gone back and watched the Super Bowl halftime show more than once and said, oh, now I understand that woman at the window with the shot of rum. In the heat of the moment, I just thought it was celebratory and fun. I didn't know she was a real woman from a Puerto Rican business in New York, Brooklyn. And so knowing it, seeing it the second time enriched it. But art that's effective is effective without the footnotes. And I sort of think, in a way, my book gives some footnotes to his works, but his works don't need my footnotes. But I think his works might help a reader take it deeper with my footnotes.
It's that revisiting.
It is.
Which causes you to, just like you said, you watch some things, people talking about this, it makes you go back to the original work to kind of take that in. It's just there for you to interpret, that lady is there. You can never know what that backstory is on that. You can never know what the backstory is of, say, for example, the sugarcane fields that were represented. You don't have to know any of those things to enjoy the whole piece. But then if you do, and that's the thing, is to look at this and have it kind of laid out there and then go back and go, I'm going to read this again with fresh eyes, with more insight, just makes it richer, more detailed in this moment. And I don't think this is a unique moment where people debate what and how history should be taught, or which books belong in classrooms or whatever. When you're talking with students and they meet Frank's work for the first time, what do you think surprises them most, either about the history or about themselves as readers?
Well, that's a great question. I think they're often surprised about the history that's been hidden from them. I think sometimes they're angry about the history that's been hidden from them. But I think something that's really very powerful is for that identification to happen. Certainly, it's relevant for my students who are young Black people from Kentucky to understand about Appalachia. That identification, that representation is very powerful. But it's important for young white students or old white students to recognize the shared humanity. I also have really powerful experience for a number of my queer students at NKU. Queer students from Appalachia are also not the stereotype. Appalachia is to defy stereotypes and to say it's not all the same. Queer white students also experience some similar expectations that they be one way and think one way. So I've had a number of students have very strong personal reaction and identification because it resonates for them. And so I think that can be very transformative. I find students just excited about this work. And I've been fortunate to teach whole classes focused on Appalachian literature. And I'm co-editing a book about teaching Appalachian literature right now with my wonderful colleagues in East Bond, a friend of Frank's as well. And we have a number of essays from multiple authors talking about how other teachers teach Appalachian literature. And it's important to do it in a variety of ways because in different states you have different restrictions and different expectations, but also different knowledge base, different types of students. And reading this literature is enriching for all of us.
Is there one assignment or discussion prompt that really just turns that light bulb on for students that you've noticed? Or maybe not. It may just be they come to things on their own as they're going through it.
Well, I think it's a cumulative effect because I do have students do traditional literary analysis of some of the works. They choose a work. But for the final projects in those classes, I give students free rein to do something pedagogical, to do something artistic. And so they get to then put themselves into Appalachia, and finding a way for that to be appropriate is sometimes a little delicate. But what I tell them is, don't pretend you're Appalachian when you're not, but find the connection. And, family and food and traditions and all of those neighborhood things that you write about in your earliest books. In this first book, Appalachia, porches make us kinfolk somehow. I think the students find that connection in ways that sometimes surprise them, but often delight them.
Frank, how do you teach students to balance research with imagination, especially when they're, writing across history in a sense?
Yeah, I think I don't really separate it from how to write any kind of poetry, starting with memory research and imagination plus empathy as kind of that's the foundation. And from that, I try to have them be guided by their own interests. So when I teach a course on historical poetry, for instance, one of the things that we do is that each student has to choose 3 subject areas. And I turn that list into the library archives department. And when we go visit, they have pulled and filled a whole shelf full of books, videos, photographs, magazines, articles, letters, all the material they could find in the 2 weeks they had on those subject areas for those students. So when they come in, they can just kind of roam through their subject areas and find something that really cuts on a light bulb for them. And I tell them to trust that light bulb, that means that they're really, really interested. Because if they're not going to really drive themselves and be obsessed with this topic enough to do all the research possible. And then to start wading through this material, looking for something that triggers you in a way that you just can't wait to share it with somebody else, that you're looking for that thing that's not been shared yet. And then we just, we move through a whole series of how to write cyclical and poems that are linked together. And they get it, but it's all driven by this kind of, really, really not strict, but rigid pedagogy that allows you to do this in a way that makes sense, but is shaped by your own personal interests and your willingness to do the research on the front end and be committed to how poetry works on the back end. And then, of course, in the editing and crafting process that makes it publishable or finished. It takes a whole semester, but we have a good time. And those semesters always close with a reading where these young people, and sometimes not so young. I had a gentleman in the last time I taught this course who was retired. He was in his early 70s but writing about Kentucky history that he was interested in. They wrote some amazing work, next to a student who was writing about the revolution in Hong Kong. And, so to hear these 2 students reading passionately about the topics that were, originally researched, thoroughly researched, and sharing that out loud, across, multiply that by a dozen students. I mean, you're talking about a powerful 90 minutes of reading, and people left there asking, where can I buy this work? And it's just brand new for them. And I always hope that they will follow it. And, 3 of those students have continued those projects. And one of them had much of that work she produced published in journals and magazines around the country, and is well on the way to submitting the final manuscript as a book, from a course that started, 2 years ago, but we remained in touch. She stayed with the research, and she's still hungry and obsessed by telling the story. And it's partially her story, her family story, not unlike my family story connected to the Civil War, but it's really about something larger than her. And that will allow other people to also feel part of the story because, they either, speak Mandarin or they've been to Hong Kong or they know the story or whatever interests them, it will bring them to that or this other part of Kentucky history. I'm always excited to see how different these students are and how the differences, drive them to something. And then at the very end, how the things link them together. But I think that's what teaching is. I think I'm a better teacher than writer because I'm so obsessed with just trying to help the students find their voices and get that material finished that it's hard for me to write during the semester when I'm teaching because I'm so consumed with their work. I'm carrying their poems around in my head, not mine. And it takes a long weekend to kind of step away from that and then get some of my own work done. But think about not sleeping, it happens. But sometimes that's what it costs.
Kristine, if someone picks up your book and they read one chapter first, where should they start and why? Or maybe it's from the very beginning.
Well, it depends. I think if they've read any of Frank's books, they should read that chapter because that will help them appreciate what I'm doing and they'll know it. The introduction, my engineer husband said, gets a little inside baseball because I'm really talking about historical poetry and doing the sort of literature review of what other people have done. So that might be a little drier. So maybe the intro is not. The afterword might, if you haven't read any of his books yet, you might read the afterword and then you kind of understand why I'm doing this. And then what I think is most effective is to read the book and then read the chapter and then look at the book again, because I think that's that appreciation, like we talked about with the Bad Bunny performance, is that you appreciate the art on its own without being biased. Then get biased with my footnotes, maybe not biased, but informed, illuminated, enlightened, and then read the work again and see something. I mean, a small example that I experienced, York in both Buffalo Dance and When Winter Come, is we get persona poems where we learn about his hunting and learn about what he's doing. But in one of them, there's a red handkerchief or a red scarf that when I first read it, I'm just like, okay, kept going. Well, in one of our conversations when I interviewed Frank, he told me that York's red scarf connected to a West African figure named Shango, who was always known, Shango, who was always known to have or wear a red scarf. Well, that made me read the poem with more knowledge. And I appreciated the poem the first time, but I appreciated it more the second time. But works of poetry don't usually have too many footnotes and explanations because it kind of gets in the way. It muddies it. A book like mine can give those footnotes in a more elegant way because it's separate from the art. You keep the art by itself, and then you bring this other material. So I think it just depends what their experience is. I think most people who come to my book, if they're not my cousin or my good friend, are coming to my book because they've read Frank. And so that's where they start. Start with, if they've only read one of his, the fifth book of historical poetry that my book addresses is not published yet, but it will be next year. His third book about York, the one that may lead to a Hollywood movie. Nobody else
as it should. It's such a powerful story.
Such a great story. But I think otherwise, starting with what you've already read or what you have at hand, get one of those books before you read my book. It'll be more gratifying.
Well, I wanted to put this out here. I don't know who I want to answer first, but Kristine, I think I want you to answer first, maybe. For someone who is new to the works of Frank X. Walker, what is the best entry point? And is it? Am I in a good place to say you should answer this first, or should I have Frank answer it first? I think I want you to answer it first. Yeah.
Well, since I've done this a lot with students who, are new to Frank, I think Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers is a great entry point if you're interested in the historical poetry. If you're interested in the more personal poetry, Appalachia, his first book, I think is the place to start. But the reason I say the Medgar Evers book is I think it helps people understand what he's doing, understanding his whole project. That introduction is really what set me on fire to write my book, because he says he hopes his book about Medgar Evers, which doesn't have Medgar Evers speaking, by the way. It has everybody around Medgar Evers speaking. But Frank's introduction to the Medgar Evers book says that he wants his book to be part of the healing and reconciliation still needed in America. And reading that made me want to teach the book with more passion, and made me look at all of the other historical poetry and see that I think he's doing something similar in all of them. They don't all have the same work to do in terms of the history being recovered. Isaac Murphy maybe wasn't as hidden as York. And Medgar Evers is really, there's a college named after him. He's not, maybe everybody doesn't know him, but he's, there has been attention paid to him. But I think that book nevertheless helps readers get into Frank's historical poetry, and then they want to read all of it, and they want him to write more of it, and they want to go to the movie. And so I think it can really, I've used that. I teach the Medgar Evers book in an Introduction to English Studies course that's not specifically Afro-Latin literature. It's not even specifically literature, but I teach it as, when I talk to students about how to do research on a canonical author where you have a lot of secondary materials available, and an author where there isn't as much available, or wasn't before my book, but hasn't been as much available, then what do? You read book reviews, you read interviews, and you also learn the actual history. And so I use it to tell English majors how to do research. But I find my students' response to that book, a lot of them are electrified, and it makes them want to know more.
Yeah, I can't disagree with either of those responses, but I would say that if the person asking me about a first book to read was a Kentuckian and new to poetry, I might point them at Isaac Murphy, because I think people get excited when they see something familiar, and I think the proximity that people would have to, Isaac Murphy's life and horse racing, because horse racing in Kentucky is a big deal. So a lot of people have some connection to horse racing, either as fans or they've been to a track. So this information is not a new learning curve for them. It's very accessible. If they're not from Kentucky, I would also agree that Medgar is a good place to start for those poems. If they don't want history at all, Appalachia used to be my go-to response, but now I think that Loaded 9 Times is a nice hybrid of historical and non-traditional, poetry that people are used to. In the middle of Loaded 9 Times, there's a heroic crown of sonnets that is stuck right in the middle of the book, and nobody's expecting that in this conversation about the Civil War. Nobody's expecting, contrapuntals or Paul Laurence Dunbar or any reference to Toni Morrison to show up. But these things are like buried treasure in this book that I think give it a whole other life that will allow it to do more work than, say, Appalachia could. I think a lot of people are attracted to Appalachia because of what they know or believe or want to have challenge about Appalachia and this idea about its true face or lack of diversity, perceived lack of diversity. But people who just want poetry in general, I hope everybody finds something, but I think the more you know about the person who's going to read, I think the easier it is to direct them to a particular book. But I respect the educator and the critical analysis version of the work than my own heart. It's like asking me which of your kids you think is the most handsome, or your favorite kid, and you can't really have one, but you do secretly, but you can never say it out loud.
As we wrap up, I want to just kind of ask in a general sense, what do you feel a real reckoning can make possible, both for individuals and for communities?
A real reckoning as opposed to a fake reckoning? I think a reckoning will lead the way to necessary healing. I think, but the challenge of that real reckoning is it can't happen without first facing the truth. And I think there's so much energy being invested in erasing the truth that we're moving backwards and away from the potential of a real reckoning and potential healing that would come from the reckoning. So I think that these are challenging times, but I'm also excited about these times because celebrating 250 years means that you're looking back at history, and it's going to be really hard to erase large parts of American history over 250 years in a way that will satisfy those people not wanting a reckoning to happen. But I think any attention given to looking backwards historically is a good thing, because I think we can learn so much from looking at the history. Celebrating 250 years forces a looking back. And I think that a full year of it, can only serve people like us who are interested in history and what you can learn from it. So I'm looking forward to these kind of conversations all year long. And I'm excited about the fact that this year is also the 35th anniversary of the Appalachian Poets. So there are a number of events happening around the country for us, locally and regionally and nationally. And with this new book coming out that Chris and Zenise are working on, that's going to continue to raise the profile of the group, and make it easier for those on the great grandfather end of the spectrum to retire, and give it to the young thoroughbreds who are smart and talented in writing, and telling their own stories. So I'm excited. I'm the eternal optimist. I really believe in the power of art and writing, and I'm, as usual, believing I can't write all the books I want to write, but I'm really interested in the thing I'm working on right now. It's always the thing I'm working on right now. So we'll get through this book celebration, and then there'll be another book to celebrate, and then another book to celebrate. I think that's a good life for writers.
I think the same way that our personal mental health benefits from considering our childhood, the good and the bad, I think our country, the mental health of our country, and the tenor of our communal engagement is deeply affected by reckoning. And reckoning, I tell my students when I've been teaching slave narratives and some things that, I teach Toni Morrison's Beloved. There's some horrible trauma there, but we don't read it and engage with it to make anyone feel shame or blame. We read it and engage with it so that we have a more authentic sense of the truth. And that's healthy for us as individuals, but it's healthy for us as a country. And I agree with Frank's optimism about this 250th anniversary. History is full, and there are a lot of good things in history, but there are some negatives that we need to acknowledge. But much like dealing with childhood trauma for ourselves, it makes us stronger. It doesn't weaken us. And, Toni Morrison said about writing Beloved, if they could live it, I could write it. And I tell my students, if they could live it and she could write it, we can read it. And I say that directly about people who want to ban Beloved. But I think that's relevant for Frank, what Frank is doing with historical literature as well, and writing his historical poetry. We are paying homage to the ancestors for the suffering they went through by taking it seriously. If they could live it and he could write it, we can read it, and we'll be better off for doing that.
Excellent. This has been a fantastic conversation. Reckoning with the Past, the historical poetry of Frank X. Walker is the book. It is published through University Press of Kentucky, and it is available now, correct?
Yes.
Wherever books are sold, your
Absolutely.
local bookstore, please check it out. Kristine Yohe and Frank X. Walker, thank you so much. Congratulations, Kristine, on the book. It really is just a fantastic trip through these stories and through Frank's work, and I hope you have a great amount of success with it, and we look forward to the next piece of work from each of you as you move on.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Great being here again.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Blue. Behind the Blue is a production of the University of Kentucky. For more stories about how the University of Kentucky is advancing our Commonwealth, visit uknow.uky.edu.